It's funny, as I'm planning and building the van, there's all these things I take for granted in a house that I haven't really thought about very much. Running water, electricity, even the toilet. They all need individual thought and attention. Of course, we'll talk about those in future videos. But this time around, there's one thing that I really hadn't given any thought to in a long time, because you just don't see it. It's always hidden behind the walls, or rather, inside the walls. That's right, this week we're talking about insulation. Insulation, insulation, insulation. It's not the most exciting topic, but it is important, so let's have a quick look through it, shall we? Now, as you all know, of course, the purpose of insulation is to stop heat going to cold. That's to keep a warm van nice and warm in the winter, or to keep a cool van nice and cold in the summer in the face of the fierce sun's heat. And in both those situations, you're trying to stop both conductive transfer, that's flowing through metal or other highly conductive materials, convective transfer, that's air moving it around as hot air rises and things like that, and also radiative transfer, where heat turns into infrared, radiates from a surface and gets absorbed by another one, or in some cases disappears out into the ether if you're losing heat. Now, to stop all of these, it's kind of a game of like, how far do you want to go? You can never get perfect insulation, but what you can do is get decent enough insulation. That's kind of what I've done here. I've used 3 different materials for the van. I've started off with this. This is solid XPS foam. You can buy it at pretty much any hardware improvement store anywhere in the US and probably most places around the world. It's very commonly used in houses for insulation. In fact, it comes so you can pre-snap it into stud bays. But in this case, it's not quite as easy. The van is not nice and square and rectangular like a house is. It doesn't really fit well in all the cavities. So I did use this for all the main areas. In fact, you can see here, this big pink panel on the left and the right walls there, those are XPS, and they're 2-inch versions of it too. And for covering large areas, it's great. You just take the XPS and you sort of take a cardboard template and shape it how you want. You can just use a standard saw to just make nice curved edges, and then you just adhere it to the surface you want. So in this case, I used a spray adhesive. Now do be careful, some spray adhesives will dissolve polystyrene, which is what this is made out of. And so I had to go get a specialist spray foam adhesive. This is, you know, from 3M, they make one, it's industrial apparently. It works like 3M90 does. It works like almost any spray contact adhesive, but it is particularly smelly and you really do want to wear a respirator around it. But I used that, sprayed it on the surfaces, popped the XPS in place, and then once it was in there, it's kind of a weird shape, so I used some big heavy items to brace it and make it curve slightly into the gap. And then once it sort of seated itself and kind of glued in reasonably well, I then finished around the outside with a bit more of that good old spray foam, which if you've seen previous episodes, I do love, just to hold it in place and also to fill that gap around the edge where I couldn't make it be a perfect fit. I used the pink XPS for all the big areas of the van and then started on trying to use it for all the small cavities. And the small cavities, well, they are this size, slightly bigger, slightly smaller, but they're not particularly easy to fit large pieces in. You're cutting all day, the floor was covered in pink pieces of foam. I'm still finding it around a week later after I did all of this. And so it's kind of a bit of a pain. And that's when I stopped and went, I could keep trying this. I could keep squeezing pieces of XPS foam into every nook and cranny, into every crevice and try and fill it all. But it's going to take ages and be super annoying. So that's when I gave in and bought the second thing, which is this. This is Thinsulate. Now, you may be familiar with Thinsulate from being in coats or boots or other items to keep you warm. It's the same stuff. This is just a sort of big roll of sheet made for putting in vehicles at other places. One of the nice things about Thinsulate is it is technically waterproof. If you get it wet, it will dry off by itself and won't capture moisture and get moldy. So that's nice. It's also, unlike the XPS, flexible. It's basically a fabric. What this means is if you've got lots of nooks and crannies and crevices, you can just cut pieces of roughly the right shape, spray some adhesive in there and cram it in, and the job's done. And so when I moved from the rigid foam to the nice, easy to handle Thinsulate, I must have doubled or tripled my speed of installing insulation. It was so much easier. And in fact, in some of the crevices, I could just jam it in without even using adhesive because it just expands and fills the hole and there's enough of a ridge around it. And so this is what I've used throughout most of these smaller cavities along the sort of outside of the van. They're generally down there along the bottom and along the top of the walls up here. And then I also used it, as you can probably see behind me, on the ceiling. These sort of black fabric panels here, you see just above my hand there, those are Thinsulate as well, because I did try and put one foam board on the ceiling, and you can do it again. You spray the adhesive, you sort of push it in place. The ceiling is curved though, so you're going to have to basically prop up the middle. I use a lighting stand for one of these lights for it, sort of jam it up there and keep it into the curve. It did stick. I have in fact kept that one piece of foam in there. The main problem I found with it though is that it's kind of annoying to install, and also if you look at the service temperature of XPS, I believe it tops out somewhere in the, I think 180 to 190 Fahrenheit range it's specified in the US. And on a very hot day, a dark colored van like this, the skin of the van could get hotter than that. Especially on the roof, of course, where you get most solar radiation. So in terms of both ease of installation and in terms of both worrying about service temperature a little bit, I switched to using the Thinsulate for the roof as well. And again, that was much like with the XPS. You spray your adhesive, you kind of put it up into place, and because it's much lighter, you can actually sort of just pad it into place and it fits really nicely. There's not too much need for support, but I did do the trick with the light stand as well, just to make sure that center of the arch had a decent amount of support as well. And one thing to say with the Thinsulate, it's not terribly obvious which side you want to adhere it on. I adhered it on this fluffy white side. While it doesn't quite adhere fully there, it kind of tears away a little bit. These tiny strands come off if you do that. It generally sticks pretty well, and I'd recommend doing that because then the surface you see inside the van is this nice finished sort of black material on the back. And that just looks nicer, and in general, just has a nicer finish to it. The other great thing about Thinsulate, it's also an acoustic insulation. And acoustic insulation is particularly important in a van because before all of this, in fact, way back when I was doing the first episode of this, I did some other acoustic insulation as well. And that was adding sound dampening to the actual main sheet metal of the van. Because the key thing is, right, you're in a basically thin metal walled van. It transmits sound and heat pretty well. Insulation kind of works similarly for both. You want to stop it. And so for the main sound deadening, what that is it's big sort of patches of, I think it's some kind of butyl rubber. It certainly smells a bit like it. But it kind of comes in these packets. It's adhesive on one side. It's got kind of a foil on the other one, which is also a bit of a radiant barrier as well. And you just put that on all the sheet metal panels of the van. And that kind of dulls the sound, it kind of changes the resonance and makes the panels bounce around less. It's not doing too much insulating by itself, but it's changing the frequencies that transmit more easily to ones you don't care about, basically, ones that are much lower frequency. And then on top of that, when you have the Thinsulate, there's a notable audio difference. Like as you install this, you can hear the clanking of tools and you walking around getting more and more muffled, even from inside. It's just absorbing all that sound. So in terms of sound insulation, this is really good as well. And honestly, had I gone with it at the beginning and not used the foam, yes, this is a lot more expensive. Things like double or triple at least per square foot or square meter. But it does seem like a much nicer material to work with. I think I would have enjoyed my time better, and it would have even filled these large panels here perfectly fine. So if money is no object, or at least money is reasonably easy for you, Thinsulate, it's good stuff. I do recommend it. Otherwise, this stuff still works great. And there's other foams too. You don't have to use XPS, you can use polyiso as well. Polyiso, I believe, has a higher service temperature and generally performs better in hot conditions. So if you're building a van for a hot climate, that's probably better. For a cold climate, XPS performs generally better at slightly lower temperature conditions. So it's really a big trade-off. Just don't use fiberglass. Fiberglass is really nasty and itchy. You want to get that stuff very far away from your van. It also retains moisture. People use wool as well and things like that. There's plenty of options of insulation, but I do think a nice man-made product like Thinsulate, which is super easy to install, is useful. And so those two are kind of the main bulk of the insulation. All the big cavities just had air in them. I tried to stuff at least some of this stuff in there to stop the air letting the sort of heat transmit more easily. And that's pretty good. Like, even if you just had that, you'd have a pretty good insulation job in the van, but there is one thing left, and that's thermal bridging. The way the van is built, basically there's an outside sheet metal piece, which is obviously the body of the van you see from the outside. And then the inside has these ribs, and they're kind of connected to the outside parts of the sheet metal at certain places around the van. Now, what that means is the outside and interior metal of the van, there's a continuous metallic path between the two of them. And that's great for conductive heat transfer. And yes, that's bad. It's not terrible. It's not going to be like end of the world, your van will never be warm, but you will notice it be a little bit colder, and like there'll be cold patches on the wall where those particular things are. And in fact, if it's a cold morning outside and you go outside, you may in fact see condensation patterns on the side of the van where the ribs aren't, showing you the heat transferred out and sort of melted and evaporated on the water where the ribs are. So all of this to say, basically, you want to not have those thermal bridges. And how do you stop thermal bridges? Well, with a radiant barrier, which is a bit like this. So this just a thin plasticky foil, I'd say here, with a plastic foam core between them. And this performs two functions. One, the reflective surfaces are radiant barriers in that they will reflect radiant heat. So any infrared light coming and trying to absorb into the material will bounce off back inside the van where you want to keep it, or outside the van where you want to keep it, depending on the season. And then in between, this plastic is a conductive barrier. This stops the heat conducting from either of these two more conductive shiny surfaces. And what I've done is like, well, this is pretty thin, right? It's not going to take too much of your interior space. And so as you can see, all these shiny surfaces along the top here and up here as well, all the interior sheet metal that you would otherwise see in the van when the cavities have been filled is covered with this stuff, with the low E. And it's not too hard to do. It's very easy to cut. You can just use some scissors to cut it. And I sort of went round, made some templates, and then just popped it into place. In pretty much all of the van, I'd say, it's held in just by the other fixtures and fittings. So like the rails and stuff you can see up there, just holding it in. And where there weren't any fixtures, I just put a couple of bolts and washers in just to hold it in place. It's not glued at all. It retains its shape really well. And because it comes in a really long roll, these sort of pieces you see here, front to back, those are one continuous piece of this off the roll. I bought enough I could do that end to end. So it sits in there really well, and pretty much every bare metal surface is covered by it to stop that thermal bridging happening from the ribs into the van. That's also true of the roof. I haven't actually done it on the roof yet, so there's still a few bare bits of blue sheet metal there between the Thinsulate, but when I'm done, there'll be a thin one of these on each of those ribs as well, held in place by the ceiling rails for all the ceiling storage bins and what have you, and the ceiling itself. So that's still to come, but I think you get the idea. So that's most of the insulation. There is one more thing, which is conductivity is a very fickle beast. And in particular, I'm sure you haven't failed to notice that behind me is a bed frame. I finished this very recently, that's the next video. This bed frame is made purely of aluminium. Aluminium is a pretty conductive metal, especially by thermal standards. And so if you just blindly go about it, you will make this wonderful frame, you will make the side rails it connects to, and you will bolt those straight into the van's sheet metal. And congratulations, you've made a conductive path from the nice cold/hot sheet metal into the interior of your van. So I need to thermal break the metal from touching the van. So there's two ways I did that. First of all, these side rails here, the ones that the whole structure is attached to, as you'll see in the next video, those are not touching the sheet metal behind them. Instead, the low E is sandwiched between them and the wall, and it's compressed a little bit, like it compresses down reasonably well, but there's still enough foam there to provide a bit of a conductive barrier and stopping that heat crossing into the nice cold metal. The second one, of course, is the fact that, well, there's bolts through from this rail into the van, and those could be a bridge too. So if you look very closely, I've used plastic washers on those bolts to try and ensure that no exterior van metal is ever in a full conductive path with interior van metal. Again, it's insulation, it's an imperfect science, right? Like, Will it stop all the heat transferring? No, of course it won't. Someone's going to jump the gap somewhere, but it should do a pretty good job of making it stay where it's supposed to be, either inside or outside. And crucially, it means that I'm not going to have really, really cold metal framing under the bed or behind the seats or wherever I'm going to be using it. So that's a nice extra thing I needed to do because I was using metal. If you're framing with wood, then, well, wood is not very conductive for heat. So congratulations, your job's done for you. However, it is going to be harder to work with, as we'll discuss in the framing episodes. So I look forward to talking more about that. Still, that's insulation. Is it very exciting? No, of course it's not very exciting. Is it important? As I said at the beginning, absolutely. And with these kind of three materials, you can do a pretty good job. I think my biggest regret so far is using this pink foam. I could have afforded way more Thinsulate and it would have been much easier to install. And I think would have given me even more sort of acoustic dampening inside the van's interior with these big panels here. So that's kind of annoying, but it's fine. I think the foam will be good enough. I'll live with it and I'll report back and make sure that it doesn't degrade thermally on the sides here if the van gets too hot. That's my one concern it might do. And then what's next time? Well, next time is this big boy. This is the bed frame. It's been finished in the last couple of days. It is, as you can see, all extruded aluminium. It's been very fun to build, unlike the very painful and week-long process of spraying lots of very bad for your general medical system adhesive on the other stuff. And so I'll talk you through both the design for the bed and how it slides, and then the process of constructing with the actual extruded aluminium itself. And for that and most future episodes, I'm going to move from this kind of position here outside the van to inside. We've kind of got through what I would call the basics, right? The van is now a livable space with insulation and flooring, and it's generally fitted out generically how you'd want it to do. The rest of the things from here on are very specific inside the van things, framing, electrical, water, and what have you. So next time I will come back, we'll look at framing and we'll discuss all that stuff. And until then, I'll see you around.